Even with all our development and laws and efforts, why do we still struggle to be global leaders in environmental quality? Exploring this question can orient us to creating a realistic, feasible, and effective environmental protection effort. My name's Danielle, and I extended this question to dozens of environmental agencies and organizations and conducted interviews with a lot of representatives and wonderful people from agencies including the Department of the Interior, the Environmental Protection Agency, state legislatures, enforcement agencies, public lands agencies, oil and gas companies, research groups, conservation nonprofits, and more to ask the question, what are the barriers to effective environmental protection? The answers varied and are probably limitless. But interestingly, three major themes seem to emerge. From this question, an unintended second research question naturally emerged. What are the best approaches you've found in your work for effective environmental protection? Again, and unintentionally, three major themes emerged directly from the mouths of the environmental protection specialists from a variety of niches and expertise. What specifically is the problem? What specifically is the solution? Can we take and consolidate decades of experience across a spectrum of experts into a digestible initiative for effective environmental protection?
Policy itself doesn't make a difference when there's no one who's actually taking responsibility for it.
The international border was not drawn along the watershed line, and water does not respect political boundaries.
Well, what am I supposed to do here? This permit makes no sense. Give me a lawyer to translate it.
The knowledge gap from the employee that retired with 30 years of experience and that information never got passed on.
You can remove the sediment, but at the same time, you're gonna disrupt habitat by doing so.
The known substitutes is by far the most commonly reported barrier to pollution prevention by industry.
Everyone is on board, right? Everyone is excited and wanting to do the right thing. But whenever you put a budget plan in front of people, that's when things get challenged.
They just weren't going to comply with the rule because they didn't agree with it.
Resources, whether it's equipment, whether it's staff to do our work, is always a challenge. Fighting for budget money.
For us, money is people.
We only had one guy to cover 400,000 acres by himself.
Also the fact that there is a very, let's say, short-term vision on where do you want to put your investment.
The resources are going to be spread out amongst those various needs. It takes what's called relentless incrementalism. We all want to see improvements overnight, but it's not going to happen.
There's so much to do, and life is so precious that I just choose not to sit in a corner somewhere and rock back and forth in fear. Be encouraged. We are moving in the right direction of eliminating barriers for good environmental policy.
With the hundreds or thousands of pieces of environmental legislation, laws, policies, regulations, and as many environmental agencies and organizations as there are in the United States, you might think we had this conservation and sustainability thing down. And we've come a long way from where we started. But our recent score in the International Environmental Performance Index is 71%. It's a C-, in some categories a D-. And the US is ranked number 27 in the world in overall environmental performance. Isn't America number 1? When did we switch the chant to we're number 27? Even with all our development and laws and efforts, why do we still struggle to be global leaders in environmental quality? What are the biggest challenges to effective environmental protection? Existing research on this question is limited almost entirely to the private sector. Like, why do businesses and industries have a difficult time implementing sustainability initiatives? Valuable, But this is not the extent of the question. What are the challenges across all sectors? Private, public, and nonprofit. What barriers do the enforcers run up against when they're trying to do their job? Or the innovators? Or the policymakers? Or the conservation specialists? Or the businessmen? Or the average citizen? This research is limitless, but exploring this question can orient us to creating a realistic, feasible, and effective environmental protection effort. My name's Danielle, and I extended this question to dozens of environmental agencies and organizations, federal, state, non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, and private businesses. I actually conducted interviews with a lot of representatives and wonderful people from agencies including the Department of the Interior, the Environmental Protection Agency, state legislatures, enforcement agencies, public lands agencies, oil and gas companies, research groups, conservation nonprofits, and more to ask the question, what are the barriers to effective environmental protection that you have found in your work? The answers varied and are probably limitless. But interestingly, 3 major themes seem to emerge. Parts 1 and 2 of this project will explore these themes in their own words, and we'll hear what the 3 major challenges are across the board to protecting the environment. From this question, an unintended second research question naturally emerged. What are the best approaches you've found in your work for effective environmental protection? Again, the answers varied, but again, and unintentionally, 3 major themes emerged. For those of us wanting to do more to protect our resources than change our light bulbs, minimize beef, and vote, Parts 3 and 4 of this project cover the 3 best approaches to making a substantial difference in environmental protection directly from the mouths of the environmental protection specialists from a variety of niches and expertise. Equipped with these insights, we can take an educated approach to creative problem solving, policy design, enforcement procedures, sustainability initiatives, productive conversation, and the ultimate goal of effective environmental protection. What specifically is the problem? What specifically is the solution? Can we take and consolidate decades of experience across a spectrum of experts into a digestible initiative for effective environmental protection? Let's start with the barriers as the experts see them, in their own words. The first of the 3 major barriers to effective environmental protection is enforcement issues. We can have all the administrative environmental protections we want, but they don't mean a thing without enforcement. Let's get into why.
In many places where we work, often in the forest in these remote areas, these are in countries, there are governments, there are policies that are supposed to be enacted there, but there's no one actually there to enforce them. And so in many ways, policy itself doesn't make a difference when there's no one who's actually taking responsibility for it. But policies themselves can be useful. And so in many ways, even if the police themselves aren't able to respond, even if the local people cannot rely upon law enforcement to actually make a difference, they can actually be the ones to take responsibility for it. So in many ways, we're able to use the fact there is a policy to work with local groups, pull them together, have a mandate to actually stop illegal logging in an area. So policy itself, while very important for establishing who has sort of the mandate to make a difference, ultimately it's up to local people who are effectively the law and order agents in these areas to take these things into their own hands.
A leading reason enforcement is inadequate is the lack of enforcement resources, whether that's staff, time, funding, will, capacity, or even hesitation around real physical danger.
The problem is also the fact that there is a lack of enforcement. So many of those policies are implemented, but not so well. And then internally, there is a lack of capacity, a lack of staff, and that is, of course, linked to the lack of political will and the lack of finance. But at the end, this is what is missing.
The biggest issue was there was a lack of enforcement. We only had one guy to cover 400,000 acres by himself. So he would tell us that, there's certain things that we just can't enforce because he's too busy. He's like a town completely in the next door, and he's not going to get there for another 4 hours. So there was a big lack of commitment in terms of law enforcement because of our just lack of funding and just how big our district was.
One of the major problems we had was someone running the enforcement program who didn't want to enforce the law. And the consequence was that they spent all their time inspecting people they knew were in compliance, so they never had to do anything. The bad actors were the ones that were never inspected because it took a lot of time to find them, because they were always gone whenever you tried to find them.
Another issue enforcers face is the challenge of plain language. Some of these regulations are written so formally in legalese, they don't set you up for success, either to follow them or enforce them confidently.
The other challenge is clarity. In other words, are the regulations clear on what is and is not expected of a particular discharger? And you can start with the Clean Water Act. Is that clear enough? And you can boil it all the way down to the permit language. Is that clear enough? And then I'd say one step further. How clear is that permit language to the person implementing that permit? One of the challenges for our agency is you've got two different constituencies that you're trying to satisfy. You've got every time we do an enforcement action, it's challenged by lawyers, it's held up in court, it goes through court. So then we try and write permits that are more prescriptive, more detailed, more lawyery, if you will. And the downside to doing that is then we lose the general audience and the mom and pop industrial operators that are just trying to follow, well, what am I supposed to do here? This permit makes no sense. Give me a lawyer to translate it. If we lose clarity, the expectations are not effectively conveyed and not followed through on.
Consistently in all of my work, the biggest barrier to environmental protection and enforcement has always been an understanding of the regulations. Congress does not write the clearest laws, and the rulemaking process for agencies to implement those laws is very challenging. There's a lot of stakeholders, there's a lot of conflict in that process, and the regulations that we end up with are not always the most clear, and they require years and years of clarifying guidance before they can really be effectively implemented. And sometimes they require congressional changes that can take years to process before there's a clear rule in place for environmental protection.
Something not many people think about when it comes to enforcement is the ethical dilemma of risk assessment. What happens when it would do more harm than good to bring heavy equipment in to clean up an area than to just leave the pollution? Do you drive a bunch of heavy machinery into the wilderness and tear it up to get to an oil spill? Maintaining environmental quality isn't as simple as protect the environment, period, end of statement. There's an ethical question around the most effective ways to protect and prioritize the environment.
In some locations along the bay, there's been a lot of contamination due to shipbuilding activities and Navy activities, and some of that pollution has been there for many years before there were environmental regulations. So they weren't in violation of the law or anything like that. There weren't environmental laws back then. And so some of those contaminants they're legacy pollutants, and they're present in the sediment in the bay. And it's a little difficult because it's like you can remove the sediment, but at the same time, you're gonna disrupt habitat by doing so. So you got to figure out if it's worthwhile to take it out.
And how about turnover? An environmental specialist in the public sector retires or is promoted and takes all their experience and little insights and connections with them. Or new managers or startups come into the private sector and they don't have the knowledge of dealing with this aspect of their new position, or even realize they have to.
I would say motivations for environmental enforcement issues really runs the gamut of a lot of new people in the industry, people who are brand new, and all of a sudden the knowledge gap from the employee that retired with 30 years of experience and that information never got passed on. Those I would say are the most common.
Basically, the big corporations are there with longevity, so they know the laws and they continue to implement the laws. But with mom and pop shops, like we get metal scrap yards, they turn over, they open up and they close down, and they open up and they close down. So every couple of years, you're educating a new group.
Finally, for this first barrier, the lack of enforcement can come straight from a lack of jurisdiction. We're at a total loss for how to maintain environmental quality if we don't have the authority to enforce environmental standards across countries. Our neighbors aren't subject to our national laws, but we do share resources. How do we bring them to the table and find creative solutions when we don't have the authority?
The international border was not drawn along the watershed line, and water does not respect political boundaries or acknowledge political boundaries. It's outside of our comfort zone when we're dealing with the Tijuana River watershed, because we look in our toolbox and there's nothing that's really going to work if we don't have any authority, if we don't have any jurisdiction in another state, let alone another country. And so we have to come up with creative ideas.
The last two themes of this barriers to effective environmental protection question are explored in part 2. And best approaches to overcoming these barriers are in parts 3 and 4. Keep it going. What are the barriers to effective environmental protection, as the experts would tell us? Part 1 of this series explored the spectrum of enforcement issues, but there are 2 more major themes that emerged from the interviews conducted with environmental protection specialists across the sectors. The second theme across all sectors is resources. Resources could mean budget, but it also means staff, equipment, time, scope, a variety of priorities and needs, and it could mean insufficient resources for both enforcers or for violators.
For my agency, part of the difficulties with protecting the environment come down to resources. Having enough resources, whether it's equipment, whether it's staff, to do our work is always a challenge. Fighting for budget money to be able to make sure that we have what it takes to be able to accomplish our goals, our missions, our responsibilities. And the other aspect too is just there are so many different responsibilities that we have. It's very varied. The good thing is that the people that we do have take this very seriously. So our managers, our management prioritizes our resources and takes in a lot of feedback and comment from members of the public to decide what is best for our region. What is the areas that need the most focus.
And then there are the lack of funding to implement those policies. But the fundings are also the fact that there is a very, let's say, short-term vision on where do you want to put your investments. And then the fact that, of course, the environment is not seen yet as the the fuel of a sustainable economy, or a green economy, as you want to say, that has, of course, a long-term and very short, not a lot of short-term gain, but a long-term economic impact.
The biggest thing is funding. And that issue is complicated because, our major town that we were next to was Pueblo. So we just don't have a high revenue from recreation or timber sales or fishing license or hunting licenses. So there's that really just lack of money that's coming in, and without some sort of federal budget overhaul, there really won't be any solution to that.
The dischargers don't have all the money they need to do the job right, and we don't have all the money or resources. For us, money is people, to make sure that they're doing the job right. So on both ends, emphasis on the finances the resources that need to be put into it.
I used to live in Tijuana. I lived in Tijuana for 4 years. And And I know a lot of people in the US, they just don't get how things work down there. They don't really understand the economic differences and living those economic differences day by day. The neighborhoods where sewage accumulates and runs off across the border into the US, there's no way that in the near future that this community is going to have a stellar wastewater collection system to stop that from happening. There's so many needs here. There are needs for education, for paved roads. Even if you put in a wastewater collection system, they wash out all the time. It's got to happen concurrently. And that's unfortunate if you're really focused on one type of improvement, and you're going to see things progress and evolve together. And so the resources are going to be spread out amongst those various needs. So I think it's just a barrier perspective-wise if people can't grasp that and be patient with it.
The final theme in the investigation of barriers to effective environmental protection is obstacles in the private sector. These obstacles range from the highly reported industry issue of there being no known substitute to current methods. If you want to fly a rocket, you gotta use rocket fuel. To well-intentioned barriers like budget or capacity constraints, to less well-intentioned barriers like blatant disregard or just laziness. Overall though, even businesses that want to have a strong sustainability presence, and most arguably do, barriers in the private sector are a big struggle for the environmental protection effort.
The Toxics Release Inventory is one data source that collects information on barriers to pollution prevention or source reduction. And the most commonly reported barrier amongst the 20,000 plus facilities that report to the TRI each year is no known substitutes.
No known substitutes is by far the most commonly reported barrier to pollution prevention by industry that reports to TRI. So what that means is that we make a certain product. In order to make this product, we have to use this chemical that's on the TRI list. We can't use anything else. It's the only chemical that can be used for that.
In my experience, a lot of the times when we come across entities or people that are violating the law, they can kind of fall into several different reasons. Sometimes it's being lazy. People don't want to take the extra step to do the right thing, to protect the environment. So instead of taking, say, used motor oil and taking it to a recycling center, which takes extra effort, they'll wait till the middle of the night and they'll dump it into a river, or they'll dump it into the street and it will then flow into the river. So that's why I say they can do the right thing, but it takes extra time and it's a pain for them. So that's for some people that do that. For other people, it could be that it costs a lot of money for them to treat the pollutant that they have. And so therefore, they don't do that extra step. They save money on that. And that allows them to do their business at a lesser cost. So maybe they can offer their product at a lesser amount and encourages business and sales for them, whereby the competitor that might be across the street is suffering because they're doing all the right things when it comes to pollution prevention. So that's the other aspect. And then you have some people that just don't like being regulated. And so they decide, you know what? I don't want to have to follow these rules. This is America. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And if they want to penalize me, if they want to issue an enforcement against me, go ahead, bring it on.
There are fundamental disagreements with what the law should be, and I have a couple of examples of those where I was attending a seminar on oil and gas accounting, and several prominent attorneys gave presentations in the meeting that said they just weren't going to comply with the rule because they didn't agree with it. And it was established case law. The case law had been in effect and known since the 1950s, and these attorneys were telling their clients, don't comply with it because we don't agree with it. Ultimately, that did not work out well for their clients. It resulted in settlements related to that particular regulation, and we have a much better compliance factor now than we did 5 years ago with that particular regulation. But it runs the gamut, everything in between, new guys to just disagreements with the regulations. Those that disagree with the regulations tend to get the biggest penalties, and it does catch up with them.
When we are having internal conversation, internal stakeholder engagement, doing that change management, whenever we talk about corporate social responsibility, sustainability, carbon footprint reduction, let's protect the one planet we have, everyone is on board, right? Everyone is excited and wanting to do the right thing. But whenever you put a budget plan in front of people, that's when things get challenged. And that's what I want to kind of emphasize, is really that the way we've built business is really focusing on short-term return. It is hard for them to get budget to work on something that's out of their scope. The whole financial model are just not designed to think in a very circular way. Our shareholders are looking at our short-term return, right? Quarterly, they want to see us driving better revenue. It just doesn't allow us to take a hit to readjust our whole financial model and our whole operation to adopt that circular model. The gap is not people don't want to do it. It's people wanting to do it, but we don't know how to demonstrate the value of sustainability using the current financial model and economic model that we've built in the past 20, 30 years.
So, enforcement issues, resource insufficiencies, and private sector obstacles. How do we overcome these barriers? This emerged as a natural but unintentional second question each of these environmental protection experts passionately went into. Spoiler alert, it isn't just, we need more money. What are the best approaches to effective environmental protection? Check out these insights from these experts in parts 3 and 4. What are the best approaches to effective environmental protection? My name's Danielle, and I conducted interviews with experts from across the environmental protection spectrum, federal and state agencies, nonprofits, and private businesses, to gather insights from decades worth of experience to the most effective ways to protect the environment. Only after conducting this research did I realize 3 major themes emerged across all sectors. The first and most common and passionate advice from this spectrum of experts is collaboration, the humanization of your opposition, incorporating a variety of expertise and resources from across the fields, active listening, acknowledging the validity of other perspectives and priorities, empowering from within because imposing doesn't work, framing your needs to fit with theirs, educating and being educated, finding commonalities, participating in productive discourse, and remembering that perfection is the enemy of good. Here are the experts breaking down what specifically collaboration looks like beyond just a kumbaya theory.
Conservation and environmental protection on a global scale, especially as it relates to climate change and biodiversity loss. This is everybody's problem. It's something that affects everybody throughout the entire planet, whether you live in the forest, whether you live in the wild, or whether you actually live in a city. This will affect us all. And so it actually is not something that anyone should be denied the right to be a part of in protecting the planet. Ultimately, at the end of the day, me as an American doesn't have the right to tell somebody whether they're a legal logger or not in an area to stop cutting the trees. We have to rely upon solutions that affect local people enough that they can actually take that initiative themselves. So at the end of the day, it's important for us to put ourselves in their shoes and not try and solve the issues that we think they need from the point of view of having fewer resources than us, but solving the issues that they might need from the actual problem in front of them. We need them to actually stop illegal logging. We need them to protect these areas. And so at the end of the day, we're trying to solve their problems. In Silicon Valley, there's a mantra that you're supposed to solve your own problem because you know your own problem's the best. And while that's very good advice, at the end of the day, if we're trying to address global warming, and the most effective person who can do that is somebody trying to protect their own backyard in Brazil, sometimes solving their technological problems and their issues and being tech support to those people might be the fastest, cheapest way for someone like me to affect climate change.
It takes what's called relentless incrementalism. You know, we all want to see improvements overnight, but it's not going to happen. And when I talk to people in the US that are very frustrated by that, I say, take a look at our history before we had the Clean Water Act, or shortly after, before, you know, the ball had really gotten rolling on it. You'll see the same things here, and look at it now. The most important thing is that you have to empower from within. So you can't be an outside entity and try to orchestrate what's going to happen. You see that a lot. You see people kind of wanting to impose or rescue. You have to empower from within. You have to clear those channels for people to have a voice, and for people to have the means to make improvements themselves. And it's a team effort. You know, it's not just citizens, it's legislators and a lot of others.
The best approach, in my experience, to effective environmental enforcement has been frequent public outreach and education. I've found that the more often we were out in the field dealing directly with lessees, dealing directly with company representatives, company attorneys, company accountants, anytime we could go directly to those people, they became a little bit more knowledgeable of the regulations. They were a little bit more willing to talk to us about what was going on in the industry. And they were a little bit more willing to share some of their challenges, because industry had their own challenges as well with environmental enforcement. They're not just dealing with a federal structure. They're dealing with a state structure and a county structure and sometimes a city-specific structure on top of us. It always helped if you had excellent communication and you were doing outreach to talk about what it was you wanted to see in the environment. If you want to be involved in environmental protection, I think you have to keep in mind that there are many perspectives within the realm of environmental protection, and it's going to have to be a middle ground. It can't be hard line, all or nothing. Anytime you can reach over to the other side and at least understand their perspective, you're going to be far more successful with your environmental enforcement action than if you just take a hard line and you're unwilling to listen to some of the concerns, and sometimes they're legitimate logistical concerns as well. And you need to understand all parts of the picture before you pursue an action.
Well, everything that is done top down cannot work because the governance itself is broken, is not functioning. We are promoting more and more a different level, what we call participatory approach. That means, first of all, bringing together the stakeholders or the local communities that have the ownership of their territory to protect it, to manage it in a different way. And we have done this by promoting dialogue, trust, and engagement, not only between us as WWF, but also among them and among different stakeholders group. I'm talking about, for example, the fishers together with the scientists, together with the local administrations or the tourist operators, that there is a lot of interaction and conflict. So by addressing the conflicts, by addressing their needs, to look on how to overcome those difficulties with the objective of having a long-term, planning approach or a long-term vision on how to manage the areas. And this is done at the very local level, but then this should go up and up. So by trying to put together the conservation sectors and the fishery sectors and other different stakeholders that should collaborate together. So if you bring together those practitioners that have the same problems all around the world, they can feel, first of all, not to be alone. They are not alone, facing a lot of problems every day, but they can also think in a more innovative way and can have, ideas that by being in the same bubble, it's very hard to have. What we have done that we see that is working is listen and understand. understand what is the problem, what is the problem of the person or the group of the target group with whom we have to deal with, and trying to take into account those problems. Because if a fisherman is going all the time to fish and to overfish his own area, it's because he has no other choice. It's not because he wants to kill all the fish in the sea. So if you want to try to address the problem, you need to have this understanding, and you have to put yourself in his shoes or their shoes. And these create an approach that create a dialogue, and not the resolution of all the conflicts at all. And this is impossible. But at least finding common ground, finding common areas of collaboration where we can work together for a certain numbers of objectives.
In my experience, the best strategy for us as an agency for protecting the environment is to try initially to be cooperative with any entities that we see that are in violation. If we can educate them and get them to understand why they need to do some of these environmental protections, then they can go ahead and implement those. They can educate their employees, they can educate their neighbors, and they can do the right thing, and the environment gets protected.
What has been somewhat effective, but you have to be very patient in the process, is a collaborative approach. And so you have to bring various entities together that might not have the same priorities, but they're compatible priorities. We'll all have our limitations as agencies, but we'll also have certain opportunities that others don't have. And so if we can kind of come together, we can collaborate, and as a team, we can share information, we can cobble together funds from different funding sources, and can move forward on projects. So basically, really building collaboration. I think what's really essential in collaborating, it's not just a matter of saying, oh, we're gonna form a committee and we're gonna have meetings every month. You know, there's a lot of behind it with respect to kind of philosophy and emotional intelligence. There's a lot of wisdom and a lot of success in just listening to others. You know, a lot of times we kind of just want to figuratively speaking, barge into the room and say, here's what our needs are, here's what our mission is, here's, you know, what our agency is charged with doing, and this is what we expect to see. But there's a lot of other things around that desire, right? And not everybody else in the room, that might not be their top priority. They might think it's a worthwhile priority, but it might not be their number one priority. Really, really listen. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to fully understand sometimes. It doesn't mean that you're going to agree. It doesn't mean that you have to agree. Just try to understand how it all fits together. And as you do, you'll kind of see how priorities overlap. I'm going to give one example of that. So for a couple of years, I worked for the Marine Corps. I worked for the Environmental Affairs Department. I was promoting generators that were solar powered. So this guy, that I was speaking to, he just thought, you know, environmental protection was just some stupid hippie thing, that there wasn't any value in that, and just not an attitude that embraced environmental protection at all. But what I explained was that because these generators wouldn't be using fuel or much fuel, you wouldn't have as many convoys required to go out to these remote locations to replenish the fuel source, because you had the solar panels. You know, they would go along predictable paths, and a lot of times they would be attacked, and many of them got hurt, and many of them got killed. So when I translated it to how many lives could be saved, then it spoke to him. Okay, so if I had kept trying to go at the environmental protection angle, if I was talking to him about climate change and greenhouse gas, I would have never gotten through to him. But I realized, you know, just because I'm promoting it from that angle originally, that's not the only priority. And I obviously also prioritize human lives. And when that sort of dawned on me, and when we had the discussion with that being the focus, that finally spoke to him. But there are a lot of opportunities for that kind of thing. Just because your agency or your NGO prioritizes one particular issue, it doesn't mean it's incompatible with another agency that, you know, their primary focus is something else.
My recommendation is always start with the return on investment that we can demonstrate through the existing structure. If we're trying to bring a new structure in, people are often just uncomfortable with change, anything that they don't know. So I would say look into the existing structures, design for durability, longevity, and repairability. It will actually help us to reduce our operating costs. And that's what I meant as following the current framework, understand how the financial model works in a company, and pick the battle that is actually worth to fight for. And you sometimes don't even need to say, we should improve durability and repairability of our design for sustainability. Don't even say that. Just say, it's going to reduce cost. Then you secretly add into your sustainability agenda in it. Sometimes when you bring in sustainability, people still have that feeling of, it is just something good to have, maybe we don't need to pay too much attention to it. But if you are able to change the dialogue and figure out how to integrate sustainability initiatives with cost reduction initiatives, then you don't even need to say sustainability. You can get leadership attention immediately. And then you say, plus we get sustainability value out of it. And they're like, great, we can save money and work on sustainability.
I believe communication is the key. When we can sit and give different perspectives, it helps us. I learned something new. And then I apply what I learned. So be encouraged. The barriers in the past are not barriers of today. If we talk to the same people all the time, there's no advancement. Different perspective, that's when we get to share different points of view. What I find most important is find that common ground. We need a safe environment to live in, and we have to preserve the environment we have. Everyone wants that. So communication is very important. Talk to different people that are different from you, and hear what they're saying. And not argue, but I like to make suggestions. What if we did this? And then let them speak. Because when we do that, they realize they want the same thing we do.
There are two more best approaches to effective environmental protection that these experts dive into in our final video, part 4. Check it out. What are the best approaches to effective environmental protection, as the experts have found across the decades and across the sectors? Part 3 of this series explores the importance of collaboration and the specifics of what that needs to look like in order to work. In this final video, these experts are going to break down the last 2 themes of best approaches they've found in their work to effective environmental protection. Next up, is the role of new ideas, innovation, resourcefulness, working locally, creating digestible solutions for people, introducing new and dedicated workers and perspectives into the system, developing productive discourse, and finding your best method of influence.
What we need is innovation, more fresh ideas, a completely different way to collaborate, to think in a different way, to integrate different fields. We need to have those from people that are exposed to a completely different environment. I mean, this is the only way to create innovation. Innovation is not only a technological, discover or, finding the new way to go to Mars. It's really a different way the approach to work in a different way.
There's no shortage of possible solutions to fighting environmental destruction and damage. At the end of the day, you are looking for solutions that work there in the field. There's no global way to actually affect environmental change on a global scale. And in fact, every conservation solution is ultimately quite local. And when you're local in these very remote areas, like the rainforest, like these remote areas of the forest, of the oceans, it's important to work with what's already there. And what's already there is usually not what you're used to. So being able to adapt and figure out solutions that exist, work with people who are there and find solutions that matter to them is incredibly important. So at the end of the day, the solution has to come from something that they recognize and one that they'll actually own well after you leave.
The people that I work with are so dedicated. All the people, we have about 70 people in the office. We have geologists, we have biologists, we have engineers, we have attorneys. Everybody is just so dedicated towards the environment, wanting to make this place the best possible place it can be, so that not only can we enjoy it, but others in the community, but for the next generation and the generation to come after that. So that's the part that it's just, that you're doing good for your community, and we can see the benefits. We can see the improvements happening with some of these cases that we do each day.
This is a very important conversation, and you can't have it or resolve it with half of the people, because when it comes to important things, people matter more than party. People matter more than party. So what I would encourage everyone to do is look at coming ideas that are being shared across the aisle, across the political spectrum, and across different geographical locations. We all want the same thing. We want to preserve our lands as long as we can for generations to come. I once heard someone say, you can't fix a problem with the same thinking you had to get us here. You have different people that come into office. People get fired every election season and new people come in. In our campaign cycle, we have a lot of young people coming in with a new perspective. Sometimes people stay in politics way too long, and the same thinking they had when they came in 20 years ago, they still think that way. Be encouraged that younger people are stepping up to serve.
I believe that the best way to get involved in environmental protection and be effective at it is to make sure that you're pursuing something that you're interested in. Obviously, if you're interested in environmental protection, that's one thing, but you can do that many different ways. You can, if you're creative and artistic and you enjoy creating documentaries, that's one way. If you're a big math and science nerd, it could be engineering. If you're very articulate and a people person, you might be the leader of an NGO or a strong force in an NGO that advocates for the cause. You might run for city council. So there I think it's very important to couple your values with your skills when you're pursuing environmental protection. If that's what you want to do, that's how you're going to be successful, and that's how you're going to have sustained success.
Finally, the last theme to best approaches to effective environmental protection is to be proactive. Find ways to reach out first. Focus your attention on prevention more than on reprimand. Support the small local players. Educate, promote the information, invest in research and development, initiate frequently, and invest your energy in a project that fits you.
I think at the end of the day, if we recognize that the climate change and environmental loss affects us all, it's important to look out and find the people who are least appreciated, who might have the biggest impact. They may not be near you. You don't have to travel to the other side of the planet to help somebody in the forest or to give them the right support. In many ways, just showing your support for the work they do can have a huge, huge impact. We've been able to see that a ranger in the forest who's just protecting his own backyard, who can have a bigger impact on fighting climate change than a dozen engineers at an electric car company, just by protecting his one forest from illegal loggers. But for him, it's actually an uphill battle, a dangerous one all the time. So being able to actually connect with these people, which we can do over Facebook, over the internet, and actually give your support to them, it suddenly turns these people into the rightful celebrities and appreciated people that they should be. And so just showing your support from across the world and pointing out that a local problem on the other side of the planet affects the rest of us, which it legitimately, statistically does from the point of view of carbon impacts, can make a big difference.
I think what really would be best is to educate the people who work in the mines, because the average guy doesn't know anything about these things. And the people that are down there in the mines, if you can educate them, and they all know, then something might get done. And you could educate the unions.
From my point of view, environmental justice really is making sure that all communities are protected environmentally, that there aren't areas where, due to economics, due to race, that those communities aren't being hurt, that those communities aren't taking the burden of environmental pollution. We reach out to those communities and we talk to their leaders for environmental groups, for community groups. We try to make sure that we're speaking the same language. So if we need to translate documents or to have translators available, we do that to make sure that the meetings and the opportunities for impact or for input are conducive to them. We may schedule meetings after hours, after business hours, so that members of the public can attend. We also look at maps to try to see which areas are harder hit economically, which areas are suffering the most from the pollution, and we try to address those and prioritizing what areas that we look to try to have cleaned up.
I think it's everyone's job to try to find better ways, environmentally preferable ways to manufacture things. I think that there's a strong financial incentive for chemical companies to implement green manufacturing practices. So they know it. I mean, when you're dealing with a profit-driven organization, anything that can cut down on expenses, production expenses, and maximize profits is a very, very strong incentive to do that. So yeah, I mean, many of the major manufacturing companies, they invest a lot into research and development to find better ways, improved ways of manufacturing products. Because in the long term, it'll cut down on their expenses in having to manage waste, which is very, very expensive.
What I've learned, and I think this has been demonstrated by studies, is that the informal enforcement is far more effective than formal enforcement. In other words, we have a much higher likelihood of being able to correct behaviors and actions through frequent inspections, correspondences, and conversations with the discharger than we do through less frequent penalties and formal orders and litigation. So my advice to other regulators would be try and spend all available resources on that compliance assistance and compliance assessment side of things to prevent violations from happening.
Recovery in a different way that we've always done it in the past. It no longer serves us. Preoccupy your time with a project like this and put your focus into this, because this is how we do this. I choose to focus on what can I do every day that we take towards a better tomorrow. Everyone else will catch up, and that includes politics. There's so much to do, and life is so precious that I just choose not to sit in a corner somewhere and rock back and forth in fear. And that's all we all have to do. Just a little bit of action every day will eventually make a worldwide difference. We are moving in the right direction of eliminating barriers for good environmental policy.
With the themes of barriers and best practices to environmental protection, we can together design an approach to conservation and sustainability that is strong, realistic, and effective. While the information is fresh, jot down some ideas of ways you can involve yourself or ways that you can promote these insights for the development of a productive and powerful environmental protection effort.